The Guardian Angel on the Highway, based on a true story. It was a late autumn night, and Jason had been driving for hours. The sky was dark and empty, with only the faint glimmer of stars to guide him down the seemingly endless stretch of highway. He had been on the road for nearly 8 hours, pushing through fatigue and restlessness as he made his way back home from a work trip. Jason's eyelids felt heavier with every passing mile, and though he blasted the air conditioning and tried singing along to the radio, the struggle to stay awake was a losing battle. He had planned to stop for coffee a few exits back but had convinced himself to push on a little further. Just another hour, he mumbled to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was surrounded by darkness, with no other cars in sight, and the rhythmic hum of his tires against the pavement only made his eyelids droop even more. As he continued, the yellow lines on the road began to blur, and he blinked hard, trying to shake off the haze that was settling over him. But it was no use. His head dipped forward, and within moments, he was drifting into sleep, his foot slackening on the accelerator. Just as Jason's car began to veer off the road, he felt a sudden, violent jolt. Like a strong hand had shoved him back into consciousness. His eyes flew open, and his heart pounded in his chest as he quickly grabbed the wheel, pulling himself back into his lane. His car had been dangerously close to the guardrail, but he was now steady, back on course. Jason gasped, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. He looked around, bewildered. The highway was just as empty as before, with not a soul in sight. He had felt a presence, though. He was sure of it. It was as if someone had been sitting beside him, nudging him awake at the last second. His skin prickled with goosebumps, and he shivered despite the warmth of the car. Taking a deep breath, he pulled over to the side of the road. The world was silent around him, and only the soft ticking of the cooling engine filled the air. Jason rubbed his eyes and tried to process what had just happened. He knew he had dozed off, but how had he woken up just in time? And what was that strange sensation, as if someone had been there with him, protecting him? Jason's hands shook as he reached for his water bottle, taking a long drink to calm his nerves. He didn't believe in the supernatural, or at least he hadn't before tonight. He prided himself on being a rational man, someone who could explain things away with logic and reason. But this defied all explanation. For a moment, he considered calling someone, his wife, maybe, or a friend. But what would he say? That he felt an invisible hand guiding him back to safety? He shook his head, feeling foolish. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, taking a few more steady breaths as he tried to regain his composure. As he sat there in the stillness, Jason began to feel an unexpected sense of calm wash over him. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, wrapping him in a blanket of warmth and comfort. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard a soft whisper, a voice, though he couldn't make out the words. He snapped his eyes open, but the feeling lingered. It wasn't frightening, in fact, it felt oddly reassuring. He couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone, that someone was watching over him, guiding him safely through the night. After a few minutes, Jason decided it was time to get back on the road. He was still tired, but something in him had shifted. He no longer felt the bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued him earlier. Instead, he felt alert, as if he had just woken from a restful sleep. He pulled back onto the highway, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He still had a long way to go, but he no longer felt the creeping dread of falling asleep at the wheel. He kept driving, alert and focused, and before long, he saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. Jason exited the highway and pulled into the parking lot, grateful for a chance to stretch his legs. As he got out of the car, he looked up at the sky, which had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The stars were fading, replaced by a soft, rosy glow on the horizon. He took a deep breath, savoring the cool morning air, and felt a renewed sense of gratitude. Jason wasn't one to dwell on things he couldn't explain, but the memory of that night lingered with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching over him. Over the next few days, he found himself researching guardian angels and reading stories from people who claimed to have had similar experiences. One story, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a man who had fallen asleep at the wheel and had woken up just in time to avoid an accident. He described feeling a presence, just as Jason had, and spoke of a deep sense of peace that had washed over him in the moments after. Jason couldn't believe how closely the man's story mirrored his own. It was almost uncanny. For the first time, he began to wonder if there was some truth to these tales of guardian angels, these mysterious protectors who appeared in times of need. One evening, as he was recounting the experience to his wife, she listened quietly before nodding thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "I've read that guardian angels don't always reveal themselves, but they leave little signs. Maybe it's their way of letting us know they're there." Jason considered her words. He had always dismissed such things as coincidence or imagination, but now he wasn't so sure. He thought back to that night on the highway, to the strange sensation of being jolted awake, and the warmth that had enveloped him afterward. It hadn't felt like coincidence, it had felt purposeful, intentional. The more he thought about it, the more he began to believe that someone had been watching over him. Whether it was a guardian angel, as some might call it, or simply a force beyond his understanding, he couldn't say for certain. But he felt a profound sense of gratitude, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone. A few weeks later, Jason decided to pay a visit to his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Miller, who often spoke of her own encounters with guardian angels. She was known in the neighborhood for her stories and had a reputation for being a bit eccentric, but Jason had always enjoyed her company. As they sat in her cozy living room, Mrs. Miller listened intently as Jason recounted his experience. She nodded knowingly, a twinkle in her eye. "Guardian angels are all around us," she said, leaning forward. "They don't always show themselves, but they're there, keeping us safe." Jason found himself drawn to her words, feeling a sense of comfort in her presence. She spoke with such conviction, such certainty, that he couldn't help but believe her. Before he left, Mrs. Miller pressed a small silver pendant into his hand. "Keep this with you," she said, her voice soft. "It's a symbol of protection, a reminder that you're never alone." Jason thanked her, slipping the pendant into his pocket. As he walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of peace, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. In the days that followed, Jason found himself reflecting on the experience with a newfound sense of wonder. He no longer felt the need to explain it away or rationalize it. Instead, he accepted it for what it was, a moment of grace, a brief glimpse into the unknown. He began to notice little things, subtle signs that seemed to remind him of that night. A feather on his doorstep, a sudden feeling of warmth when he was feeling down, a quiet voice in the back of his mind urging him to stay safe. He knew it could all be coincidence, but he chose to see it as something more. For the first time in his life, Jason felt connected to something greater than himself. He no longer feared the unknown, instead, he embraced it, finding comfort in the knowledge that he was never truly alone. As the months passed, Jason found himself sharing his story with others, recounting the night on the highway and the mysterious presence that had saved him. Some listened with skepticism, while others nodded in understanding, sharing their own stories of guardian angels and inexplicable moments of grace. Jason no longer cared if people believed him. He knew what he had experienced, and that was enough. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the unseen presence that had guided him safely through the night. He carried Mrs. Miller's pendant with him wherever he went, a reminder of the night he had been saved, of the guardian angel who had watched over him. And as he moved through life, he did so with a quiet faith, a belief that there was more to this world than met the eye. Jason continued to travel for work, but he no longer dreaded the long stretches of highway that lay before him. He knew that wherever he went, he would be watched over, guided by a presence he couldn't see but could always feel. As he drove down those dark, empty roads, he no longer feared falling asleep at the wheel. He had been given a second chance, a reminder that there was more to life than what he could see and touch. And as the miles stretched out before him, he felt a quiet sense of peace, a reassurance that he was never truly alone. For somewhere in the darkness, his guardian angel was watching over him, guiding him safely home. Thanks for watching. If you like this uplifting story about a guardian angel and want to watch more like it, make sure you like and subscribe.